The following podcast contains mature language and discussions that are not suitable for younger audiences. The opinions voiced in this podcast are our own. We are not experts on the topic we present, but have conducted our own research. Listener discretion is advised. November 29th, 1980 was a particularly dark and stormy night. A man from Duncan, British Columbia named Granger Taylor left a note for his parents to find. The note stated that he was about to embark upon a 42-month interstellar journey on an alien spacecraft and will return after his voyage was complete. Granger Taylor was never seen again by anyone, and this case remains one of Canada's strangest and most enduring stories. Did he really travel to outer space to explore the cosmos? Or is there another earthly explanation for his disappearance? This is the Strange and Undecided podcast. Hello, and welcome back to the Strange and Undecided podcast. Pat's back from outer space. Welcome back.
Yeah, this whole story, it's just like a typical Friday night for me, so I don't see anything strange or undecided about this, so...
Have you heard anything about this case before?
No, not the case.
All right, well, you're in for a treat then. On October 7th, 1948, Granger Ormond Taylor was born in Duncan, British Columbia. This small logging and fishing town is located on the southeastern shores of Vancouver Island. Granger's life was not easy, as his family was struck with tragedy when he was an infant. His biological father drowned from an accident while on a fishing trip on Horn Lake. When Granger was 2 years old, his mother married a man named Jim Taylor. Jim would bring with him 2 children of his own. Granger would grow up with a total of 7 siblings. This included 3 biological siblings, 3 step-siblings, and 1 half-brother. Not an unusual size for a family back in those days, however, Granger was very different than his siblings. It was evident to Mr. and Mrs. Taylor that as they watched Granger grow up, he wasn't like the other kids. He had a tendency to be very withdrawn and was socially awkward, preferring to be alone than in the company of others. What Granger lacked in social skill and interaction, he made up for with his talent for mechanics. Granger led an unconventional childhood, where he would hide away alone in his bedroom and would dismantle toys and other gadgets to try and understand how they worked. By the time Granger reached the 8th grade, he was no longer interested in school and ended up dropping out after finishing the year. He began working in local mechanic shops and worked as an apprentice for his neighbor, who was an auto mechanic. Granger was like a sponge, absorbing all the knowledge and information being imparted onto him. For most people, this would take years to master and learn to be able to run a shop of your own. For Granger, it came all too easy. Only 1 year of learning from these mechanical shops, Granger went out on his own, as he felt that he had all the necessary information and experience he would ever need.
Prediction: this guy builds his own UFO and hovers away.
We'll get to that point.
So far, this guy sounds a lot like me, which is a little terrifying. You couldn't give me like a G.I. Joe or like a toy car. Like, I needed like a transformer, like something that I could build and...
Something way more engaging. He was allowed to set up shop on a forested property belonging to his parents and started to work on his own projects himself. Keep in mind, young Granger was only 13 or 14 at this time. Many of the projects Granger would go on to complete, he would sell to various private collectors and even the provincial government for a good amount of money. He was nothing short of a mechanical genius. At 14 years old, he started and finished a project where he built a single-cylinder car. The car is now on display at Duncan's British Columbia Forest Discovery Center. 3 years later, at the age of 17, he rebuilt an abandoned bulldozer that was deemed unsalvageable. In his early 20s, he started another project where he restored a rusted steam locomotive that he had found in a forest. It had been there so long and was left there since the Great Depression that trees were growing inside and throughout the train. But this was just a small obstacle for Granger.
What a find.
It took him 2 years to restore the train to full working order. He even put train tracks down on his parents' property, which drew attention from the local kids. He began taking them for rides in it. His workshop and the train began to draw in more and more kids as they were enamored with the wonderful creations Granger had made. Imagine being 20 years old and rebuilding an entire steam locomotive from scratch, basically.
Yeah, what were you doing at 20 years old?
Yeah, not that. Earthbound vehicles were no longer interesting to Granger like they were before. He now turned his interests to the skies. After he finished working on his train, he began to work on an old World War II Kitty Hawk fighter plane, which he found in terrible shape in the woods.
Jesus, what are all these things doing in the woods up in BC?
It's just stuff that gets abandoned. From what I read, it was a lot of stuff after the Great Depression that was just kind of left in places to rot. And he just, with the adventurous soul that he was, went out and found all these things somehow.
I hope somebody looked into this airplane thing. Maybe there's like a pilot body that no one's ever found.
As far as I know, it was just like abandoned in the woods on like the side of a highway.
Hey, when in BC, we don't question.
He did not have his pilot's license, but no matter. The airplane was missing parts and only a section of the fuselage, some of the landing gear, and a partial cockpit were able to be salvaged. This wasn't a problem for Granger, as he used repurposed metal signs and water heaters to rebuild the entire plane. The plane sat on display for years on the property that he worked and eventually was sold to a private collector for something like $20,000. The whereabouts of this plane were not known for a long time, but eventually it was tracked down to an aeronautical museum in North Dakota who had purchased it. Originally, the plane was sold off to a private collector from North Dakota.
And this thing is like in working condition?
Yep.
It's impressive.
Very impressive. Granger was constantly on the lookout for new projects, but what really caught Granger's eye was something not of this world. For those of you who don't know, Vancouver Island is a UFO hotspot, and I'm about to explain one reason why. In 1969, on New Year's Eve, something strange was spotted at the local hospital, which was close to Granger's home. At approximately 5 a.m, 4 nurses tending to patients spotted a brightly lit flying saucer hovering outside the windows. The window it was spotted outside of was 3 stories off the ground. The first nurse to spot the flying saucer hovering outside the window stated in an interview that she could see 2 distinct humanoid-like creatures standing inside the craft. How could she see them? She said the craft had a window, so she was able to see inside. As the other nurses started noticing what the first nurse saw, they watched completely awestruck. They watched as the craft drifted behind the trees eventually and then shot off into the night sky like a shooting star. The nurses at the hospital weren't the only ones who witnessed this flying saucer. Throughout the entire day and into the night, residents of Duncan, as well as a pilot from the Royal Canadian Naval Air Service, reported seeing a similar flying saucer shooting through the sky. But it wouldn't end here. In the following months after this event, more and more people began seeing flying saucers and speculated that maybe they were aliens. This became a regular occurrence on Vancouver Island, hence why it is called the UFO hotspot. Granger was fascinated with UFOs, and as he got bored of fixing and restoring conventional mechanics, Granger wanted a new challenge. So he turned his focus to figuring out how flying saucers worked. More importantly, how UFO propulsion worked.
This is quite interesting that he was interested in this at the time. What would this be? Maybe like the 1960s?
Like 69, 70, right around there. That's when the actual UFO was spotted, was 1969. So his interest began in 1969 and just kept growing after that point all through the 70s.
Do you know when the Roswell incident happened? Because I believe that was kind of the catalyst to everybody's UFO interest / hysteria.
So Roswell, New Mexico, for those of you who don't know, that's probably one of the most famous UFO crashes in the world. but also probably documented as one of the first. That happened in 1947.
47. So he had about 20, 30 years to ponder this UFO thing.
So apparently he really wasn't interested in UFOs before this kind of 1969 event happened at this hospital. He might have had interest, but this is what propelled it to what it is going to be, which we'll talk about in just a little bit.
It's like kudos to him to have such an odd interest. Like now we sort of talk about UFOs more in the mainstream, but back then I can't imagine many people were.
Nope, you're correct about that. But also like good on him for sticking to what he wanted to do. And it wasn't the norm.
Yeah, no doubt.
Nobody on Earth has made something of this level, and Granger wanted to take a stab at it and be the first. He then set out to build his own greatest creation, the construction of his very own flying saucer, or rather, a replica of one.
Do we know if he personally saw a UFO or if he just heard these accounts?
As far as I know, he just heard about it. There was no information saying that he actually saw one himself, rather that he was just really interested in the topic.
Yeah, it really captured his imagination.
For sure. Granger began by building himself a structure which looked like a UFO. It had the same dimensions as the saucer that he wanted to build eventually. Kids and teenagers from the area came to help him build his UFO. Granger was able to find 2 radio tower satellite dishes from the local dump and use them for the top and the bottom of the UFO structure.
I thought you were going to say the local woods.
I mean, it basically is the same thing.
Yeah.
He constructed this building at the edge of his parents' garden on the property and placed it on stilts. It resembled a sort of tree house almost and a hangout space. He painted the sides of the structure with a lightning bolt and outfitted it with a window. He then furnished the inside of the UFO structure with a wood-burning stove, a couch, and even a television. The last touch to make this perfect that Granger did was place many different science fiction novels and pseudoscientific books about UFOs on the shelves.
Fuck yeah.
With the structure now complete, Granger began the challenge of trying to figure out UFO propulsion. Between 1979 and 1980, Granger would spend most of his time alone inside his UFO, where he would think up how he was going to make a real UFO, getting lost in his books and almost becoming one with the idea. After months of burying himself inside the world of UFOs, something amazing happened to Granger. While he was sleeping one night, he claims that aliens talked to him in his dreams.
Some might call amazing, some might call terrifying, to each their own.
He was completely floored in a good way. One of the kids that came around to hang out with Granger was a troubled teenager named Robert Keller. Granger had taken Robert under his wing and kept him out of trouble. Robert was one of the very few people who was told about what Granger had experienced. Granger explained to him that aliens from outer space had contacted him in his dreams. Granger wanted to contact the aliens back, so he acquired a radio, fixed it up, and then modified it so he could potentially contact them. But why Granger? Why would they contact him? Was it his eagerness to learn about what was out there and his willingness to connect? Granger claimed to have been contacted more times after this by these aliens in his dreams and telepathically. During these conversations, he would ask them as many questions as he could about how UFO propulsion worked and what he could do to build his own. The only answer he ever got back from them was that the secret to the propulsion had to do with magnetism. They refused to divulge any other secrets to him. But this didn't deter him in the slightest. He kept asking questions and was immensely overjoyed to even be having these discussions regardless of the outcome. In October of 1980, Granger received news that would change his life forever. He told Robert and another friend named Bob Nielsen that the aliens contacted him again, and this time they extended an invitation to take a trip with them through the Milky Way galaxy. They couldn't believe Granger's story fully and thought he was either making it up, joking around, or was just plain crazy. They weren't able to tell if he was hallucinating either. During this time, it was confirmed by Granger's sister that he was taking LSD and acid regularly.
Oh, I was right.
Sometimes 3 times a day. Despite this, if aliens were going to contact anybody on Earth, everyone who knew Granger believed that he would be the perfect person. His friends wanted to go with him and asked him to ask the aliens if they could come along. Granger said no, they weren't allowed to come because they would be leaving much behind here on Earth. When they asked Granger when this would happen, he told them that he was going to leave and be picked up on a rainy and stormy night, and the aliens would use the weather as cover so people wouldn't see them. Approximately 1 month later, on November 29th, 1980, the town of Duncan was hit by what newspapers titled the storm of the century. Complete with booming thunder, massive strikes of lightning, torrential downpour, and gale-force winds, the storm unleashed its wrath upon the city, causing flooding, and trees to fall over, and power lines to go down. According to a weather report, the amount of rainfall was 310 millimeters, more than double the average, and it surpassed the old record of rainfall, which was 300 millimeters. At around 6 p.m. that evening, right before the storm hit its worst point, Granger walked into one of his favorite places outside his UFO and workshop, Bob's Grill. Granger went in as he usually did and sat down. Granger was dressed in jeans, logging boots, and a brown knitted sweater. To the waitress that served him, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. However, she did mention that she thought he was not properly dressed for the weather. Granger came in without a coat and seemed to be not prepared or not affected by the weather outside. Around 6:30, Granger finished his meal, paid his bill, and then proceeded to leave the diner. He got in his 1972 Datsun truck and drove off. This would be the last time Granger was ever seen again. The following day was a complete disaster due to the storm. The people of Duncan were busy clearing their properties and the roads of fallen trees and various debris the wind had blown in. Granger's stepfather, Jim, discovered that Granger was missing. Granger's mother was on a vacation in Hawaii and was not at home during the time. Jim was looking for Granger when he found a note taped to his bedroom door. The letter said this, quote, "Dear Mother and Father, I have gone away to walk aboard an alien ship, as recurring dreams assured a 42-month interstellar voyage to explore the vast universe, then return. I am leaving behind all my possessions to you, as I will no longer require the use of any. Please use the instructions in my will as a guide to help. Love, Granger." On the back of the note was a hand-drawn map. It was hard to make out where exactly this map led to, but many believed it to be of Waterloo Mountain, which was only about 15 kilometers, or 10 miles, to the southwest of Granger's home. Was this the spot where Granger had been picked up by the aliens? Or was it something else? He also left his will behind with detailed instructions for his parents on what to do with his possessions after he left. What struck me as strange was on the will, Granger had removed the word funeral and swapped out the word death for departure. Jim and his sons began searching everywhere for Granger. They checked in hospitals, his favorite spots, and would even drive down quiet logging roads in hopes of finding some indication as to where Granger might have gone. During this time, Jim reminisced about a conversation he had with Granger the night before. Granger had gone into his father's bedroom and told him how grateful he was for everything he had done for him, even though he wasn't his own biological father. The search continued, but nobody could find Granger or his truck. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP, got involved and exhaustively searched for Granger, but with no luck. For years after 1980, they would continue searching, and every time, they found nothing. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, months turned into years. All his family and friends were left with were questions about his disappearance. This remained a mystery, and the circumstances surrounding his disappearance made it even more mysterious.
The fact that he's so nonchalant about, I'm gonna be, what was the word? Departing?
departing instead of dying. The family just hoped that after the 42-month journey Granger had told them about, he would come home. June 29th, 1983 was the date that Granger was supposed to return from his journey through space. Douglas Taylor, who was Granger's stepbrother, worked for the Canadian Coast Guard during the time. He said in an interview that he sat out for half the night on the deck of his patrol boat, scanning the night sky looking for any sign of his brother or that he was going to return. The spaceship did not appear. The sadness and disappointment swept over him as he called it a night. Where was Granger? Had the aliens taken him away and decided to never bring him back? Where was he?
How would you feel as the brother on that night that he's supposedly supposed to return? Would you feel like quite hopeful, or is it like wishful thinking, knowing that he's never coming back?
I think for starters, I can't even begin to imagine what the family and like his brother were going through. But I think all you can have at that point is hope. That's the only thing that keeps a lot of people going in these kind of situations. So you kind of have to. You don't have a choice but to be hopeful that, he is going to come home.
Yeah, it's like a little tiny sliver. It's like a slim chance of it happening and him coming home and everything being fine. But I think at that point, you sort of have to grasp at it. And then it never happens. And then you're forced to deal with the hard reality that he's probably never coming home.
Yeah, it's unimaginable pain that these people have to go through. The potential answer as to what happened to Granger would not be extraterrestrial. In April of 1986, 6 years after Granger had disappeared, forestry workers found a crater that was several meters in diameter. It was a blast site located just off Mount Provost Road. Sorry if I said the name wrong. The site itself was on the side of the mountain of either Mount Provost or Sicker Mountain, both of which overlook northwestern Duncan. They were able to determine it was a blast site as they found scattered around the area of the crater chunks and parts of what appeared to have been a truck. The RCMP were called to investigate the crater and the surrounding area. As they investigated, they discovered 2 pieces of what eventually would be proven to be human bone fragments, and they were located close to the crater. The RCMP were also able to find a small piece of a shirt. The RCMP checked the pieces of the vehicle over and found part of a license plate embedded in a tree not far from the crater. They were also able to find the VIN number of the vehicle. Upon checking who the vehicle belonged to, they discovered it belonged to Granger Taylor. They found his truck. It was also determined that the truck must have had dynamite in the back of it. Granger would regularly have dynamite in his car as he knew how to use it when clearing tree stumps and such.
That seems like a not accurate system, I'll be honest.
Police were not able to determine whether or not the dynamite was set off intentionally or by accident. Since the truck was Granger's, many people, including the RCMP, and many of Granger's family members believe that the bones recovered from the scene most likely belonged to Granger. DNA profiling was just starting at the time and could not be used as a tool to determine who the bones belonged to. As far as I could tell from what I found, the bones were never tested, so the police could not definitively say they belonged to Granger or to somebody else.
And they still haven't been tested to this day?
Also in my research, apparently they lost the bones.
It seems like a common thing to lose crucial pieces of evidence. Why does that happen so often?
I don't know how you misplace one of the only pieces of potential biological evidence in a case.
I remember reading a book about like a neurosurgeon, and he was saying that sometimes when they cut people's like skull caps off, they'll lose the skull caps.
After the heartbreaking discovery, there were a number of theories developed trying to explain what might have happened to Granger. Many believe this was simple in nature. On the night of November 29th, 1980, Granger had packed his truck up with dynamite, or had dynamite in it from before, driven into the woods off of Mount Provost Road, and the dynamite went off, causing it to explode and kill him. A final theory, and the one with the most hope, and is what Granger's mother and his friend Robert Keller believe in. That is that Granger was indeed picked up by extraterrestrials on that dark and stormy night. Robert mentioned that Granger told him years in space did not equal the same amount of time on Earth, which is
Einstein's theory of general relativity.
So that scientific theory itself, if he is in space indeed, then potentially 4 years here could be like minutes up there. And he could be back in another lifetime. And that's also something he did mention to Robert as well. He said, Robert told him, well, when will I see you again after the 4 years? And he said, no, it probably won't be in your lifetime.
So let's say he was up in alien land. Who do the bones belong to?
That's another good question. The answer will never be solved for that because they lost the bones. The police did, or they were misplaced.
Let's say he was abducted or whatever, taken. And how many years passed between his disappearance and them finding the truck?
6 years.
So perhaps say he did go on a voyage. Somebody could have stolen his truck and owned it for 6 years, and maybe that's their bones in the truck.
Yeah, definitely could be. So obviously, Granger was a mechanical genius. But do you think he was a genius in more ways than just that people didn't perceive?
The interesting thing about being a genius, I wouldn't know, but so I hear of, this is a common thing geniuses tend to talk about, is that their ideas do not come from themselves. It's almost as if they're an antenna picking up ideas from whatever you want to call it, consciousness, the ether, the universe, your thoughts. They're like a good filter. They're able to pick up on these so-called genius ideas. But from what I hear, no genius claims to have come up with it. Oftentimes, maybe even in dreams, like it just comes to them. So clearly they're on another signal.
Like they're operating almost on a different wavelength compared to everybody else?
Yeah, you could say it like that. Like their experience of reality, they're able to filter out like these minute, crazy ideas that no one else would ever think of, just because they're tuned into some frequency, you could say.
So in terms of the theories that have been presented over the years, it's really difficult to speculate on these. And there's an amazing documentary that's out that's called Spaceman, and I will include that in the show notes. I highly encourage anybody who is interested in the podcast that we just did to watch that. It focuses primarily on the family as it should and talks about Granger and his life. All that the family and friends can have at this point is hope. Hope that one day Granger will return from his 42-month journey and come back into their lives. The mechanical genius from Duncan, British Columbia, who captivated everyone with his wondrous creations, whose creations still amaze people who gaze upon them in the museums where they reside. What else could Granger have accomplished? What else might he still accomplish? All right, so that's going to end the show for tonight. If you have any ideas or want your story featured, please email us at strangeandundecided@gmail.com. As always, thanks for listening.
And good night.